Imagine this. A single unpaid debt from more than 200 years ago quietly ignited 3 different wars, toppled governments, bankrupted nations, redrew the map of America, and is still technically unsettled today. Not a myth, not a that actual financial agreement that slipped through the cracks of history and ended up shaping the trajectory of states in ways most people never learn about. And it all started with a desperate emperor, a broken nation, and a deal that was never meant to happen. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the edge of total collapse. The man who once dreamed of building the greatest empire Europe had ever since suddenly found himself drowning in debt. France was broke. Not metaphorically, literally bankrupt. Their navy was destroyed, their credit was shattered, and European banks, especially those in Britain and the Netherlands, were demanding repayment on loans that France couldn't even pretend to pay. Napoleon had only one valuable asset left, a massive stretch of land across the ocean, the Louisiana Territory. But selling it wasn't about raising money. It was about escaping creditors. In 1803, when the United States sent negotiators to buy Louisiana, Napoleon didn't offer them a simple land sale. He offered them an escape route from a financial nightmare. The US wouldn't pay France directly. Instead, America would take responsibility for France's old European debts, and France had accumulated during decades of war. On paper, it looked like a clean solution. America gets land, France gets relief, Europe gets paid. In reality, it was a trap, a financial time bomb. The numbers didn't match. Paperwork was missing. Payments were delayed or never confirmed. And the banks in Britain and the Netherlands insisted that the United States had not fulfilled its obligations. Europe believed America had helped Napoleon escape his responsibilities, and someone would have to pay. That someone, they decided, would be the United States. Almost immediately after the Louisiana Purchase, tensions between the US and Britain escalated. British warships began stopping American vessels, demanding proof that the US had paid the debts properly. The US refused to acknowledge any remaining balance. Britain didn't buy the explanation. They believed the US was hiding behind diplomacy to avoid paying what France owed. And in 1812, the conflict exploded. British forces stormed Washington, D.C., set the US Capitol on fire, and left a message written in flames across the sky. If America wanted to play with European finances, it would face European consequences. But here's the part history books smoot over. Even after the War of 1812 ended, the debt was still not settled. Britain never confirmed the final payments. Dutch bankers still claimed missing amounts. The official documents were so fragmented that no one, not even France, could prove the debt had been closed. So the anger simmered, quietly, patiently, and it didn't take long for European powers to find another way to strike. By the 1840s, the United States had its eyes on expanding westward, but just across its southern border was a young Mexico, poor and stable, and deeply in debt to European creditors. Britain and France saw their chance. If America wouldn't settle the Louisiana debt, they would make sure America paid a price elsewhere. They encouraged Mexico to push back, to resist US influence, to challenge American expansion, and to refuse any territorial negotiations. Some European officials even whispered to Mexican leaders that America's unpaid obligations made any American land claims invalid. In 1846, the Mexican-American War erupted, and while textbooks oversimplify it as a territorial dispute, behind the scenes, European financiers quietly funded resistance, armed Mexican forces, and supplied intelligence, hoping the conflict would weaken the United States, force it into deeper debt, and make it desperate enough to renegotiate the old Louisiana obligations. But that plan backfired. The US won the war quickly, seizing vast amounts of land. Still, the European banking houses refused to let the issue die. They argued that America had gained territory through a purchase it never fully paid for. Behind closed doors, European diplomats continued discussing ways to pressure the US into settling the dispute once and for all. But then came the moment they'd been waiting for, the American Civil War, when the United States split into Union and Confederacy. Europe finally saw the opening they wanted. In 1861, as America collapsed into internal chaos, France invaded Mexico, claiming they were enforcing Mexican debt, but secretly hoping that a fractured United States would finally be weak enough to accept Europe's claims about the Louisiana debt. Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon, believed he could finish what his uncle started. He installed a puppet emperor in Mexico, marched an army across the southern border, and positioned himself for a direct confrontation with the United States. If the Union fell, France would be free to redraw the map of North America on demand, settlement of the old debt on France's terms. But history took a different turn. The Union won the Civil War, and one of the first things the US did was send troops to the Mexican border with a simple message for France: leave immediately. France had no choice but to withdraw. Their attempt to use Mexico as leverage failed. But here's the most astonishing part of this entire story. Even after 3 wars, decades of conflict, and multiple governments rising and falling, The original Louisiana debt was never properly reconciled. European banks never issued a final confirmation of payment. France and the US kept contradictory records. Modern archives list the status as unverified, meaning the debt technically still exists, a 200-year-old financial ghost still floating in the background of global politics. A forgotten obligation that quietly shaped America's foreign policy, its distrust of Europe, its dominance in Latin America, and even its approach to modern debt crises. And the real question that one historians still debate is unsettling. Did the United States ever truly pay the debt that shaped its destiny? By the late 19th century, the Louisiana debt had become less a line item in a ledger and more a shadow over U.S. diplomacy, or a silent ghost that influenced decisions without anyone admitting why. European financiers still whispered in the gilded halls of London and Amsterdam. They weren't content with letting history fade quietly. They wanted leverage. And for decades they found it not in open warfare, but in finance, in treaties, in careful manipulation of emerging American markets. The story didn't end with Napoleon III's retreat from Mexico. In fact, it had only begun to creep into the very fabric of international strategy. The United States was industrializing rapidly. Railroads stretched across the continent, cities erupted from the prairie like steel and stone, and the American economy became a powerhouse. But with every new boom came new temptation. Europe, particularly Britain and France, saw the growing wealth as both opportunity and leverage. The Louisiana debt, ancient though it was, provided a legal fig leaf to challenge America's growing global influence. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War shook Europe to its core. France, humiliated and financially drained, had to focus on rebuilding. But even in defeat, the French treasury never forgot the American connection. Officials quietly reviewed old records, mapping every payment that had been missed, every invoice unverified. The goal was simple. If the U.S. expanded too boldly in the Western Hemisphere, they could still point to that unpaid obligation as justification for pressure, sanctions, or even covert action. The debt was a tool, a threat lying dormant, ready to ignite the next confrontation. Meanwhile, in the United States, history textbooks presented a neat story. The Louisiana Purchase had been an extraordinary bargain, doubling the nation's size for a relatively modest sum. School children learned the myth of a brilliant land deal. What they did learn, and what most politicians quietly ignored, was the persistent ambiguity of the original payments. U.S. Treasury records were incomplete. Correspondence between American negotiators and European banks was scattered across oceans, and yet policymakers in Washington could feel the weight of history in subtle ways. Diplomatic disagreements with Britain or France, sudden insistence on American adherence to treaty obligations, or delays in European recognition of new territorial claims. Every minor conflict carried echoes of a transaction from over half a century before. By the early 20th century, the world had entered a new era. Industrial empires collided, and global finance became more complex than ever. The Louisiana debt, though centuries old, had grown into a kind of living legend among historians and financiers alike. It wasn't just a sum of money, it was a story, a cautionary tale of how a single oversight could ripple through centuries. And when World War I erupted, the financial entanglements of the 1800s came back into play in unexpected ways. American bankers, now powerful in their own rights, were drawn into European negotiations, unknowingly interacting with institutions that still had an eye on unresolved debts from the Louisiana Purchase. French and British officials occasionally mentioned old claims in obscure footnotes of treaties and reparations discussions, ensuring that the memory of that unpaid obligation was never fully erased. It was as if the debt had achieved a kind of immortality, no longer a ledger item, but a ghost haunting international negotiations, shaping attitudes and creating a subtle bias against American overreach. The impact of this invisible debt was perhaps most tangible in Latin America. During the 1920s and 1930s, as the United States emerged as a superpower, European powers still watched closely. The debt had created a precedent. America had accepted responsibility for foreign obligations once, and the Europeans assumed it could be pressured again. Every time the U.S. intervened in Caribbean or Central American affairs, whether it was the Banana Wars, interventions in Nicaragua, or support of friendly regimes, the specter of the Louisiana debt lingered in the background. It wasn't spoken of openly, but treaties and loan negotiations often referenced European expectations about financial responsibility and good faith, indirectly tracing back to a deal made to centuries prior. Then came World War II, and the stage shifted dramatically. The United States, now fully industrialized and a military titan, was in a position to dominate global policy. European powers were no longer the architects of the Louisiana debt saga. They were desperate, occupied, and on the brink of collapse. Yet even in the ashes of war, historians and financial scholars revisiting old European archives stumbled upon fragments of correspondence that revealed just how seriously European banks had taken America's obligations. Legal scholars debated whether, technically, the debt was enforceable. Lawyers in London argued over invoices, exchange rates, and letters signed by officials long dead. Across oceans, American diplomats faced questions they couldn't answer definitively. Had the debt ever been fully settled? And if it hadn't, what were the implications for international law, for U.S. sovereignty, for future claims? The Louisiana debt wasn't just a historical curiosity, it became a symbol of America's awkward relationship with Europe. The U.S. prided itself on independence, on avoiding entanglements in old-world schemes, yet it had unwittingly inherited one of the most complex financial legacies imaginable, and in a sense, the debt shaped the very DNA of American foreign policy. Cautious yet assertive, aware of past obligations but unwilling to submit to foreign pressure, always balancing diplomacy and the threat of force. Even today, the echoes of that debt linger. Modern historians occasionally stumble across clauses, letters, or bank ledgers that suggest France or Britain might have retained a claim, however obscure. Legal experts continue to debate whether an enforceable obligation exists, hidden in the dusty folds of history. Some argue it's purely symbolic, a footnote that matters only to scholars. Others warn that the Louisiana debt is an example of how unresolved financial agreements can shape nations for centuries, quietly influencing decisions about war, territory, and international standing. And perhaps most chillingly, the debt serves as a reminder that history doesn't forget mistakes. A single unpaid obligation, poorly documented and poorly understood, spiraled through wars, invasions, and revolutions, leaving traces in places no one expected. The burning of the Capitol, the Mexican-American War, European intervention in Mexico, subtle financial leverage in global diplomacy, even shaping the attitude of U.S. policymakers toward foreign entanglements. Imagine the power of a ghost day one that outlives governments, outlives treaties, outlives the very architects of the deal, and still exerts influence centuries later. It began as a desperate attempt to escape creditors. It became a weapon in international politics. And it survived long enough to remind us that history is never as tidy as textbooks would like it to be. The Louisiana debt didn't just buy land. It bought influence, tension, and intrigue that would ripple across continents, shaping the destiny of nations in ways no one could have predicted by the 21st century. The debt is largely forgotten in public consciousness, yet it remains alive in archives, in legal briefs, in the quiet corners of European financial institutions. Scholars occasionally debate whether the debt has ever been legally repaid, and some argue that technically, if a European creditor were to press the matter, it could still be unsettled. A small, almost absurd notion on unpaid bill from over 2 centuries ago, but the power it once held, and still symbolically holds, is extraordinary, and this is where the story leaves us for now. Perched at the edge of modernity, knowing that the past is never truly past, a debt from the age of sail, muskets, and empires has left its fingerprints on the nuclear age, on global finance, and on the American identity itself. The question that lingers is not just whether the debt is truly resolved, it's whether any nation can ever fully escape the consequences of what it owes, even centuries later. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Louisiana debt had transformed from an obscure line in a ledger to a symbol of how history's shadows can stretch far beyond their own time. In a world dominated by instantaneous communication, global markets, and complex diplomacy, the idea that a financial obligation from 1803 could still resonate seems absurd, and yet, the story of that unpaid debt reveals something far more profound, that the ripples of decisions, no matter how small they seem at the moment, can echo across centuries, shaping nations, wars, and the course of global power in ways even the architects never imagined. Think about it. Napoleon sold Louisiana not merely to raise funds, but to escape Europe's relentless creditors. America stepped into a transaction it didn't fully understand. Europe, in turn, believed the United States had helped a debtor cheat its way out of responsibility, and every war, every border dispute, every diplomatic negotiation for decades thereafter carried the silent echo of that unresolved obligation. History is rarely neat. This debt illustrates that perfectly. 3 wars, multiple revolutions, countless treaties, and still no final signature confirming closure. It's a ghost lurking in archives, occasionally surfacing to influence policy or debate among historians, a reminder of the long memory of money. Even as the United States emerged as a global superpower in the 20th century, the legacy of that debt subtly shaped its strategy. European powers, weakened by 2 world wars, could no longer impose their will militarily, but the notion of obligation lingered. International financial institutions, banks, lenders, and later multinational corporations implicitly carried the same cautionary message. Unpaid obligations, however old, are never entirely gone. For policymakers, the Louisiana debt became a metaphor, a quiet lesson in prudence. Every commitment matters, every ledger must be balanced. because even the smallest oversight can come back in ways you cannot anticipate. Interestingly, the debt also shaped the American psyche in ways historians rarely quantify. Consider the nation's approach to foreign entanglements. The U.S. often avoided long-term financial or military commitments abroad unless it was absolutely in its interest, while textbooks attribute this to isolationism or pragmatism. One could argue that the lingering memory of the Louisiana debt, the knowledge that old obligators could ripple, unpredictably instilled an almost instinctive caution toward Europe. It became part of a national story, whispered in diplomatic corridors. Never underestimate the consequences of a seemingly minor financial agreement. And yet, the story is not entirely one of caution. There is audacity. America didn't collapse under European pressure. It didn't crumble when challenged in Mexico. It didn't falter when the British burned its capital. And it didn't bow even when French troops marched across the border. If anything, the Louisiana debt became a proving ground, shaping a nation that learned to navigate its responsibilities, evade manipulation, and ultimately assert itself on a global stage. History shows that debt's financial, moral, or the power to influence decisions, but they do not always dictate outcomes. The Louisiana debt also serves as a mirror to modern finance. Today, multi-billion-dollar obligations, international loans, and complex treaties crisscross the globe, creating networks of dependence and potential conflict. What happened in 1803 is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a cautionary tale for modern states and institutions. Unverified agreements, incomplete records, and informal promises can grow into global flashpoints if ignored. The story demonstrates that financial clarity is not optional. It is a matter of national security, of geopolitical stability, and, sometimes, of survival. And then there's the human side, the people who actually lived through these moments, the soldiers in the War of 1812, the Mexican fighters, the Union generals. Napoleon III's troops in Mexico had no idea their actions were part of a centuries-old financial saga. They acted out of duty, fear, ambition, or survival. And yet, they were unknowingly participants in a story that began with a simple ledger entry, a transfer of debt from one nation to another. It is a haunting reminder that history is cumulative. Even the smallest, most mundane actions of payment, delayed, a signature missing, can shape the destiny of millions. So what does the Louisiana debt mean today? Technically, it remains unverified in certain historical archives. Some legal scholars argue that the debt could still exist in theory, though in practice, any claim would be symbolic. But the symbolism is potent. It is a testament to how interconnected finance, politics, and power truly are. It is a warning that decisions made in haste or out of desperation can cascade across generations. And it is a story that captures the imagination. A single unpaid debt that ignited wars, toppled governments, and reshaped continents, all without a single modern headline acknowledging its power. And finally, imagine the ultimate irony. The debt that began with Napoleon's attempt to escape creditors now exists as a story about American power. The very nation that assumed responsibility for France's European obligations grew into a superpower, untouchable in its hemisphere. And yet, the ghost of that debt reminds us that power is never absolute. It teaches humility, patience, and vigilance. History is watching, quietly, in the margins of ledgers, in forgotten letters, in unconfirmed receipts, and sometimes, it reaches across centuries to remind us that nothing is ever truly settled. The Louisiana debt is more than a historical footnote. It is a lens through which we can view the delicate interplay of finance, diplomacy, and war. It is a story of ambition and desperation, of audacity and caution, of lessons unlearned and consequences enduring. And for those willing to look closely at history, it is a reminder that sometimes the smallest debt's monetary, moral, or political act can leave the largest marked out. So the next time you hear the story of the Louisiana Purchase, remember, it wasn't just a land deal. It was a gamble with the weight of centuries. It was a debt that haunted nations, shaped wars, and ultimately sculpted the destiny of the United States itself. And perhaps, somewhere in the dusty ledgers of Europe, that debt still waits, quietly, patiently, like a ghost refusing to rest, a reminder that some obligations never die, and some lessons, no matter how old, are never too late to learn.